In the 1950s, a group of young Turk critics and soon-to-be quite great and quite famous filmmakers, notably François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, and Eric Rohmer, began writing in the newish film journal Cahiers du Cinéma, and their guiding idea was that the director is the author of the film. This, for these young Frenchmen, was both a polemic and a rallying cry, and its strongest expression came from Truffaut, who said quite famously, "The worst film of an authorial director is better than the best film of a hack." The theory emigrated to America in the person of Andrew Sarris. Sarris was the critic for The Village Voice when, in 1962, he wrote Notes on the Auteur Theory. As Sarris would later put it, the strong director imposes his own personality on a film. The weak director allows the personalities of others to run rampant. Andrew Sarris died last week at the age of 83. His legacy in America, Dana, is a really interesting one, I think. He's certainly overwhelmingly associated with that one theory. He was also a practicing weekly critic for decades. I mean, first at the Village Voice and then at the New York Observer.
And also a professor of film at Columbia for many, many years.
And crossed over into academia. Dana, I'm wondering, as a practicing film critic, what's your relationship to the legacy of this extraordinary person?
I guess, when we talked about Pauline Kael last year, I guess it was, when the biography of her came out, or earlier this year, we touched on this a little bit because Sarris is remembered so much for his polemic with Pauline Kael, which in terms of its actual print manifestation was very small, essentially. They had one little snipey back and forth where each of them, took each other down in print. And after that, it was essentially just sort of a personal dislike that the two of them had for each other throughout their lives. But that polemic seems like it really structured mid-century film criticism. And I think, in a sense, we are the inheritors of both of them, we being people writing on film now, and have absorbed the polemic in a way that makes us able to hold on to both, right? Kael has completely changed and influenced the voice, the style in which people write about film, in ways that we've talked about earlier on the podcast, and kind of incorporating pleasure and the body and the sort of person of the author, the film critic, into the work. What Sarris has done, it seems really clearly to me, is made us all auteurists, including Pauline Kael herself. Immediately, after trashing his theory, she started to champion her own directors. And I think this idea that a director is the author of a work and that we are following the corpus of artists on film is something that we've inherited from him, and that I think we'll never shake now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Julia, it seems to me what's wonderful about this theory is it admits of so many different elements and versions, interpretations, and arguments, which is probably appropriate to the medium, right? There's no theory about, unless you get extremely esoteric, there's no theory about whether Leo Tolstoy is the author of Anna Karenina. We know he's the author. He wrote it. The same can't be said in quite so simple and assertive way about, the relationship of Orson Welles to Citizen Kane, for example, which Kael wrote an enormous and I think quite brilliant essay about. Nonetheless, this almost has to be, one legacy of Sarris is that this almost has to be an organizing principle of how we see film retrospectively. When we talk about film history, of course we're going to talk about Max Ophuls, we're going to talk about Jean Renoir, we're going to talk about Alfred Hitchcock, we're going to talk about Howard Hawks, Francis Ford Coppola, on and on and on.
Well, another thing that I would note is just how much Sarris and the French Cahiers critics elevated the art of film by asking this question, right? If you think about the way film was thought about before, right, this kind of mid-century revolution in criticism, it was essentially a popular art that was not worthy of serious critical consideration. As much as the auteur theory might go too far sometimes, right, and attempt to go back and sort of champion the work of a director, even when he is being a studio hack, or when the work doesn't necessarily derive from his creative inspiration, but from the studio, the writer, the actors, whoever, at least that ability to consolidate the way we look at film under a name, the name of an author, started to make it be taken seriously as a cultural form.
Right. It's part of the shift from films being seen as kind of industrial products of the
right,
corporate,
or Nickelodeon entertainment,
corporate
right?
studio system to being works of art. And I think one thing that fascinates me about the fact that it's the director on whom all this pressure and attention centered in the film world is the similar shift we're seeing in the TV world around its rise from being a mass and much derided entertainment into being a sort of more sophisticated and more lauded entertainment. And the fact that in the TV world, it's the writer who is paramount and not the director. When you talk about the great TV creators of the last 10 to 15 years, you're talking about the showrunner is the term that's used, and it's always the head writer. So it's Aaron Sorkin for the shows we just discussed with David Haglund. You're talking about David Chase in The Sopranos, David Simon in The Wire, Matt Weiner and Mad Men. It makes you aware of how arbitrary in some ways it is that the focal point has become the director for films. I mean, I'm not saying that it should be the writer for films or it shouldn't be the director for TV shows, but it is interesting that it's a convention more than it is just the right way to think about filmmaking, which, you know, having grown up in an era that had entirely internalized this, I've, of course, just assumed that the director is in charge of the film and is responsible for all that's good or bad about it.
Right, and this brings up a very important distinction about the author theory, right? The original French proponents of it were using it as a rallying cry for their own actual practice as filmmakers, and what they wanted to do, they were pointing principally, if I recall, they were pointing to Wells, who they worshipped, and Jean Renoir, who had made, you know, total classics of French cinema. But what they wanted to do, what Truffaut wanted to do, what Godard wanted to do, and Romer, is they wanted to make films that they wrote and directed, but that were also highly personal, and in Truffaut's case especially, highly autobiographical. What's interesting about Sarris's theory is that that's not really the way he applied the theory. He took one part of it, which was their quite daring elevation of genre directors like Howard Hawks and Hitchcock, and said, listen, this is a way for us to interact with our own American and Hollywood and very commercial and very often factory-produced film history, because we have a pantheon of underappreciated directors whose ability to append to very banal work their unique signature as directors shows that they're not only almost as good, not only as good, but maybe even better. I mean, this was the sort of strongest and most counterintuitive expression of the theory on Sarris's part. He said, look, if you go back and Douglas Sirk, I mean, one of his favorites, one of his pets was Douglas Sirk, worked against the pressures of the studio system, often with scripts that were painfully banal, mundane, just terrible work. But Sirk turned them into a kind of art. And if you watch those films now, if you watch several Douglas Sirk films and you come to understand what his directorial signature was, you can see what an extraordinary, almost Nietzschean act of self-creation it was for him to make these films. But that led Sarris, I think, into the trap that where Kael really got him. He elevated Sirk above someone like Billy Wilder. He didn't think Billy Wilder had a very distinctive technique as an actual mover of the camera, as an actual creator of framed shots, of mise en scène, to use the kind of, you know, arty term for it. And therefore Wilder, who made inarguably maybe the greatest Hollywood filmmaker who ever lived, was demoted by Sarris. So
although Sarris walked that back later in his life, which I love. You keep reading in those obituaries how he was willing to reconsider his opinions of films. He really disliked how Kael only saw movies once, famously. She said she never resaw any movies.
Yeah.
And he thought that was absolutely absurd, and he was talking about how he loved to revisit movies. I absolutely love the story of him not liking Kubrick in general, not liking 2001, but then taking a younger critic's advice that he should get stoned and watch it again, which he did, and then wrote about it again and reconsidered the movie and liked it better.
I love that story.
Yeah, the fact that he seemed to be a person who wanted to keep on thinking and keep changing his mind, that was really moving to me. It's worth reading some of these obituaries for that reason. But the other thing I wanted to say about him, and this may relate back to my own practice as a critic or not, but he was sort of the great systematizer, right? Both in the good and the bad sense. It's sort of too bad that he came along too late to be a blogger and a tweeter, because he was a great maker of lists. He loved his 10 best lists. He thought that was a very important thing to do. And essentially the notes on the Auteur Theory, if you read it through, is sort of a systematization, right? He's finding a way to classify in subgroups, very polemically, all of these directors, and who's a creator of expressive esoterica. That was one of his subgroups, you know, things like that. Maybe not a major director, but somebody like Fuller is a maker of expressive esoterica. And I love that penchant for list making, but I also think that can be a bad road, a scary road for film criticism to go down, right? When it becomes all about the system and imposing some sort of hierarchical structure or order on a system. And I think there has to be a balance of that drive to systematize that Sarris had, and then just that sort of flowering of reaction and of language and of style that Kael was about.
Right. I think that the homework assignment always has to be, if you're going to read Notes on the Auteur Theory by Sarris, you have to read Circles and Squares by Kael, and if you're going to read the one by Kael, you have to read the Sarris.
And also read both of their reviews. What did they each think of Last Tango in Paris, right?
Of actual